Morning, everybody. Welcome to 1961 Part 2, where we talk about Blue Note. We did Impulse the other day. It's funny how if I put Tone Poet in the title of something, how many more views I get. People are still searching and learning from this modern distribution sensibility, which I'm not sure I understand it. I shared yesterday the first 16 Impulse from 61, and of course they only put out 4 records in 1960 as they launched for the holidays. And Impulse puts out some incredible stuff, but it tends to be kind of all over the map, in part because it's a new institution, so we're just hiring who's available, whose contract's expired, who's out there that we can bring in. And from Basie doing that with the Kansas City 7, doing some blues and organ stripped down stuff, to the Benny Carter advanced big band orchestral stuff, to the Shelly Manne 2, 3, and 4 with various groups, intricate little ensembles, to a couple of Coltrane experiments in the road out, as we're going to tinker with that. There's just a real wide striation to what's happening. It's not one condition, it's not one philosophy, it's infinite sounds in the jazz kingdom, which in some ways is great, but in some ways it also shows you they're not really sure of exactly what their sound is going to be. And believe it or not, they really always kind of keep a pretty broad stroke to it. Even when they start doing the Pharoah Sanders and Archie Sheps in 65 and 66 and the Coltrane stuff, there's still a great degree of variety with what's happening at Impulse. Blue Note, on the other hand, 1961, 30 releases or so, and it's a fairly streamlined affair. Not to say there's not unique points of view, but it's still coming from a similar place for the most part. There's a Blue Note sound, and while one might not be able to define one of these records on the radio and say, oh, that's Blue Note, there's a lot of stuff that you hear on Impulse in 61 that you would know right away was not Blue Note. See what I'm saying? The Blue Note sound is a profound sound and a big part of the jazz scene at that point, but Riverside's doing it, Prestige has some of it. There's other labels that are definitely dabbling in that hard driving, up-tempo, aggressive black expression of my condition. No one does it better than Blue Note. No one ever will. You know, from the Wu-Tang Clan to the Sugar Hill Gang, they all take a back seat to the expression of the young Blue Note stable of black men experiencing life in America in these troubled times as those were. We think of today's difficult times for black people, and it's difficult still. But in those days, it was even more complex. So let's dive in. We got a lot of ground to cover here. 35 records, actually, which compared to the 16 at Impulse, it shows you the difference in volume and how Impulse is part of ABC and Bluesway. So they got other formats that they're releasing with each week's releases, and not just doing Impulse. They got other chapters of their umbrella that they're putting out. Blue Note's just putting out Blue Note. They're in a pretty good place right here. They're releasing most of the sessions that are scheduled for release. They go through a few rough patches where more stuff gets held back than at other times, but they're about to lose Jimmy Smith to Verve, and that's going to have a real impact on the bottom line. And they do have a lot of Jimmy Smith stuff in the vaults that they will continue to issue into the mid-late 60s, but it's not the same as having him there, having on the pulse of what's happening in modern contemporary music and reiterating that in his recording sessions. And Jimmy really was at a great place in late 50s, in the early 1960s. He's really at the top of his game. He's playing with a lot of great sidemen. He goes from just doing that bebop organ stuff in 55, 56 into being part of these cohesive blues, hard swinging, hard driving records that are just outstanding. And his departure for Verve, while it probably tripled his exposure, tripled his income, it also castrates his sound. And he's still great at Verve, but it's not a hard driving blues anymore. It's a big produced Hollywood sound, Oliver Nelson arrangements. There's just a lot of people taking control of Jimmy Smith's sessions and making these big ensembles. It really hurts Blue Note when he leaves. But 1961 starts with, and I'm going here by when these were recorded and not so much the issue date, because some stuff gets recorded and issued a little bit into 62, and there's a few things that it's not clearly defined, some of it, but this is where I'm starting. 4063, Whistle Stop, Kenny Dorham. He kind of comes and goes to the Blue Note label. He had just done a couple of great records at Time in 1960, which I showed you in 1960. They're great records. And he comes back to Blue Note here. He works with Hank Mobley, Kenny Drew, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. And for my money, this is one of my favorite Kenny Dorham records. Dorham and Hank Mobley together, to me, are fantastic. Kind of like Art Farmer and Hank Mobley together. Mobley's malleable sound kind of brings this edge to both Farmer and Dorham and makes them both sound more brilliant, more fiery. When you play with a guy that's really bright like a Jackie McLean, it's going to diminish how bright you sound in some ways. But because Mobley's soft and creamy and melodic and sensitive to your style, it kind of makes guys like Farmer and Dorham, who are more center of the road in trumpet in terms of tone and velocity, they sound more brilliant next to Mobley. Because Mobley's that type of player. He makes you better. He makes you sound as good as you can. Because I'm going to play in a way that highlights what you do well. And that's a great teammate always. Chambers, Philly Joe, and Kenny Drew around with the rhythm section. And it's just the Blue Note sound. Nice, swinging. It's really post-hard bop at this point. There's sometimes elements of hard bop in 61, 62. But we're moving back into just post-bop modern jazz. The blues still is a huge influence on a lot of these cats. Composition's becoming more front and center. And the changes that are afoot around jazz are starting to trickle in towards Blue Note. But at this point, they're still making pretty much records you can always tap your foot to, snap your fingers, put a cool hat on your head, sit in a dark basement somewhere, and sip on a cocktail with your gal. You know, it's so cool that it almost covers the anxiety and the tension and the expression that it's emoting. That's one of the interesting things about a codified message. You can't always talk about injustice just in tears and yelling and bloodshed. Sometimes you have to do it in such a way that it's so cleverly disguised that it creeps into the enemy's ranks. Comedy has that same role. Stand-up comedians can often tackle issues with a chuckle, a smirk, a pause, and a laugh that we couldn't discuss in any other form. Comedy takes the edge off. It disguises the message and makes it more palatable, like sugar. And this is what Blue Note's doing here. The musicians are giving you this sugary, grooving sound. And it's pre-boogaloo, even though the element's already starting to creep in. Soul jazz is starting to establish itself. But it's still this wonderful, somewhat saccharine, syrupy, bluesy message that's carrying the wonderful message of jazz. And I was doing some thinking yesterday, working on my new jazz journal, and like the Children of Israel, there's one second. Pardon me, I had to sneeze. Allergies. It's corn, soybean harvesting season here in country America. But like the children of Israel, like the East European immigrants that came to America in the 1800s into Chicago, like the Italians and the Irish who came to the East Coast, these groups that were oppressed find a way to overcome. And whether it's protests, going on strike, marching, writing prose, most of that will be subverted and destroyed. You can have pamphlets, you can have your own newspapers. They'll be bought out and buried. It's hard for a minority group to be able to get its message across. It's really difficult. The media is not going to give you time in the mainstream. And even those East European Slavic immigrants in Chicago who were fighting for socialism in America, trying to get rights for the worker and 10 8-hour work days and overtime and health regulations, that literature was absolutely subverted by the big industry moguls because they didn't want to lose their profit margins. And so often the message of the oppressed, it's always there, but it gets subverted and buried almost all the time. The coded message of jazz, if you're empathetic enough to hear it and understand it, know the history and times it comes from, it's still speaking loud. Louis Armstrong is still on the edge of that train platform talking about reform in a way that all the protesters and magazine pamphlets have long been suppressed and buried. 1961, another important development here at Blue Note is the arrival of the great Grant Green. And there's some people out there who think Grant Green is too simplistic. I am a huge Grant Green fan. I think he expresses the blues and the gospel and the black community with the best of them. I think he's one of the best. He might not have the technical proficiency of a Wes Montgomery. He may not have the brilliant creativity of a George Benson, who are both great players, obviously. He may not even have the same brushiness and wispiness of a Kenny Burrell, but he has the single note, single line dexterity that's rooted in bebop, that's always soaked and drenched in 80 proof blues. And to me, he's a storyteller in the true sense of the blues. He's like, sit down, put you on my knee, young man, and I'm gonna narrate something for you right here. And he's telling you about the leather strap shop working days, picking cotton in the fields, the train ride north through the Mississippi up to Chicago, the looking for homeless, a place to live, the tenements, the west side, the poverty, the migration. Like, the entire black experience is told through the guitar of Grant Green. It's potato salads and tambourine. It's gospel. It's so got the church in it all the time. He's, like I said, like, he's not the proficient flashiness of some of the great impresarios in jazz. He's more of a guy that just wants to tell you a story. A Lester Young in a sense. I don't need to use 1,000 notes to emote what I'm trying to get across. And I don't think that should diminish how we see a player. I get more from Grant Green in my gut and my feeling than I do from George Benson or Wes Montgomery. Some of that's just the setting that Wes Montgomery's put in. His records at Riverside are good, but they're not great. It's great playing. Some of them are pretty outstanding, but he's often put in these settings that I think diminishes his raw expression. And his stuff at Verve completely does that to Montgomery. But Grant Green, his Blue Note career it affords the luxury of being all surrounded by very blues-oriented guys. Sessions that always kind of swing hard. A lot of them are kind of reduced to like trios with organ, guitar, and drums, which I believe this one is. Babyface Willette, Ben Dixon with Grant Green. He has 3 records that come out in 61. We'll see the other 2 as they come out. That's 40, 64. Let's keep moving this along. This, I believe, is the 2nd record for the great Stanley Turrentine. Turrentine is one of the great center of jazz players. And he exists in the shadows of Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, and Ben Webster. And he's not trying to reinvent that formula. He's very much a guy that plays the blues from a melodic center and just tells you a story and still got that nice pulse behind it. Which is trademark Blue Note. That pep. That pop. Like that current, if that's a stream, is a bubbling fast current. Fresh water. You can drink from that stream. And it's when that groove is so solid like that a player's at his most effervescent. It's effortless to emote and drop little swirls and twirls and patterns and colors on top of this great river of groove. And again, that's kind of the Blue Note trademark. This is 4065, Coming Your Way. I believe his brother's on this, Tommy Turrentine, Horace Parlan, George Tucker, and Al Harewood. Al Harewood's a great drummer, does a lot of Blue Note sessions. Probably doesn't get the popularity he deserves. I'm not sure if he makes an album as a leader until maybe the 80s, which was strange a little bit to me. Here 'Tis is another great Lou Donaldson session. And here we hear Donaldson starting to shuffle his way towards the more soul jazz side of things. What he was doing in the late 50s was very modern, cutting edge, hard bop, roots of the bebop. But here by 61, we're going to hear Lou Donaldson start to transition more to what becomes boogaloo. Babyface Willette, Dave Bailey, and Grant Green round up this quartet. So again, you have this great guitar, organ, the light saxophone on the alto of Lou, with Dave Bailey springing along on the drums. It's a great album cover, number 4066. Classic Blue Note. Grant Green doing his thing. Babyface. There's some Blue. See what I'm saying? I think people dismiss this stuff sometimes as having no substance, and yet that's soul food. There's a lot to glean in that meal. There's some grits, there's some gravy, there's some lean, and there's some fat, juicy morsels. You can live on that type of soul jazz. It's not as light and fluffy as some modern day critics would have you think. And the catch is that it doesn't cost a lot of money. So people seem to omit affordable records from being of any value. The value on a jazz record isn't what it costs you. It's your emotional connection with it. What does it make you feel? How does it, you know what I mean? I've said that 1,000 times. You can buy a $2 record. If it moves you, that's a great $2. And it's worth way more than that if it moves you. A painting on your wall that has a connection with you and it makes you stir something every time you look at that piece of art. Does it matter if you got it at a museum, a gallery, or at a dump? Of course not. It's not where you got it or what you paid for that matters. It's the emotional connection, the inspiration, what's it saying. Jackie McLean is now becoming a stalwart at Blue Note. His prestige days are well behind him now. This is probably his 3rd record at Blue Note, I believe, 4067. Hey, we got a dog. Dogs and cats take time to do their little mixing in. Kira, this is Bluesnick. number 4067. Kira, come here. Say hi to the people on YouTube. She's a little husky girl. She's 2 years old. My wife adopted her. She's adorable. My kids love her. I love her. She's fantastic. But her and my cats are making a truce at this point. Freddie Hubbard, Kenny Drew, Doug Watkins, and Pete LaRocca, which is a bit of a different groove than the Grant Green, Ben Dixon, Babyface Roulette sound. This is the other edge of Blue Note at this point. And they're not that far apart. But this has a little bit more edge. McLean's got that more tense, aggressive frustration emulating from him. See, Grant Green's eating potato salad with a tambourine at church. He's okay. He's not that tense. McLean's like, you know what? I grew up in these New York City streets. Bird passed away recently. Clifford Brown's gone. Yeah, there's just that attitude from McLean at this point that's powerful and it's got some anger in it. He recruits Hubbard, who again, Hubbard's one of the great empaths, and he adds to any record he's on, as I've said 1,000 times. Kenny Drew plays the piano, who's a fairly sophisticated modern approach player, and Doug Watkins has a lot of edge to him, and Pete LaRocca is a really creative drummer as well. So it's a brilliant session, and it's got a lot of guts to it. Great cover, fantastic Blue Note cover. There's Jackie sitting on the street side. Could be West 67th, who knows? One of the side streets of the great city. But great record, pretty tough to come by. Classic Blue Note cover, and of course, the great Jackie McLean. Number 4068, Babyface Roulette. This is the first of two records that he's going to do here in 1961. He shows up as a sideman quite a lot in 61, 62 at Blue Note before he departs for Argo, where he makes a couple records, and then he kind of just disappears out of the music scene, Babyface. He's a great player, and he's probably the first attempt Blue Note makes to replace Jimmy Smith. Pretty much from 55 to 60, 61, Jimmy Smith is the Blue Note organ player. You know what I mean? When you got Wayne Gretzky, how many more Hall of Famers you need? You know, he was just locking it down. And they put out 4 of his records a year sometimes, 5 records. Like, he was prolific. With his departure, he wasn't just a great personality, he was a big part of their financial bottom line. And so they kind of scramble a little bit trying to replace him. And Freddie Roach, John Patton, there's a long line of guys that comes to the organ in this period trying to fill those shoes at Blue Note. This has stupid Obi strip from Japan blocks the band here. It's Fred Jackson, who I forgot is on this. Grant Green, Ben Dixon, and Babyface Roulette. Fred Jackson's a great soul blues player, and Fred Jackson makes a great record coming up here in 61 on Blue Note. A fairly unheralded guy who's kind of more of a soul jazz in the Texas tenor, real bluesy barbecue kind of sense. That's where Fred Jackson comes from. But with Grant Green, Ben Dixon, fantastic Babyface Roulette. That's a Classic Records reissue. Then the 2 records set by Grant Green, kind of a working group they had for a little while with Grant Green, Horace Parlan, George Tucker, and Al Harewood. Again, classic Blue Note art department by Reed Miles. That's often imitated by other people. It's just fantastic. The color choices, the framing of the entire thing. It's great live, hard-driving, blues-soaked Blue Note. And we're going to just kind of move along because we got a lot of records to cover. Grant Green's second album, number 4071, Green Street. Again with Ben Tucker and Dave Bailey. So it's a trio, bass, drums, and guitar. And it just rolls along. what I like about Grant Green's records is the accessibility of them. Again, as a guy who's a DJ, I do a lot of reading rooms, testing music, seeing what people's parameters are, what's too far out, what's gonna make you squint and cringe, and what's gonna make you go, oh, I kind of like this. What is that? And DJing as long as I have, for as many people as I have, over 20 years, I've gotten fairly good at reading the difference between, oh my God, turn this shit off. Could you ask him to turn down? And the room coming up to you and saying, this is awesome. What is this? It feels pretty different when you're connecting versus when you're annoying people. And as a DJ, there's no question which one's more fun. But you learn pretty quickly in that commercial setting when you're out there trying to embrace people and want them to embrace you because you want to keep getting paid. It's not like my ego's going to say, I'm going to play what I want to play, because no matter how many people dislike it, they're going to keep paying me to do this. Wrong. If you put yourself and your self-indulgence over the audience, you're going to have a short-term life as a DJ. You know, and unless you're in a specific scene, there's not a lot of room to be always informing people about new deep hidden stuff. If you're a house DJ in a house scene in a local area, you can be playing local house cuts and they'll be blended in and danced in. People won't care. But if they're just having a little brunch and they didn't really come to hear a DJ and you're there doing your thing, you better not annoy them. And if you play songs they know and intersperse it with fun stuff that they love, that's easy to digest, this is very digestible. With a sprig of orange juice, and a little hash brown with some Tabasco, some Grant Green feels absolutely fantastic. He was a real staple of my brunch set at the Red Cow for those 2 years. It's been a long enough time now where, with this COVID thing, it's hard to envision me getting that gig back, which it sucks for me because that was truly one of my funnest gigs I've ever had. It's top 3. You know, my Triggs gig was legendary with the Black Soul Night for 7 years, and then I did this independent gig that was pretty outstanding before that for 5 years. But the Red Cow brunch was a fun experience. I had grown up a lot, matured. I didn't want to play club music as much, so to do a Saturday morning brunch, it was perfect for me. This is the Three Sounds, probably their 4th record, maybe 5th even, at Blue Note. Gene Harris, Andrew Simpkins, Bill Dowdy. I think they have at least one more record here in this stretch in '61. They go back into about 58 at Blue Note, and along with Jimmy Smith, make some of the most commercially successful products at Blue Note. These records sold well. That's why they're out there. That's why they're affordable. They're not affordable because they're garbage. They're affordable because they sold well, and a lot of people still have them, and no collectors out there on YouTube going, look at my Three Sounds record I got for $14. It's the coolest thing ever. I must be so knowledgeable because I got this rare. It's so phony at times. It just shows the limitations of your scope. When you're up there showing me 4 records that you paid $200 a piece for, like you just sit there with a fine pick tooth comb looking for these rarities, thinking that makes you some kind of expert on something. It doesn't. It doesn't. Be clear. This is gold. This is treasure. It's accessible. It's bluesy. Harris is a fantastic swinging pianist. The rhythm section's always laying down a solid groove. The link here again to soul, R&B. Ray Charles isn't that far from this at all. There's Ray Charles records that sound pretty much just like this. And so when I tell people that jazz doesn't die and it doesn't become avant-garde and disappear, jazz grafts itself into rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues was always an extension of blues and jazz anyway. But the traditional grooves and sounds of jazz, as that generation kind of fades away, rhythm and blues and jazz kind of re-immerse together. And there's a lot of very groove and jazz records that sound a lot like the Ray Charles soul music of the late 50s, early 60s. And they're very contemporaneous, and they are interlinked. You know, that's important to grasp. It's the music of the black community is really what we're talking about here, and that never goes away. It might get new names from time to time. It might change how it looks from time to time, and certain branches of the tree might fall off and die. But jazz never really died. It just got adapted and became the rhythm and blues. And even the fusion era, that really wasn't the beginning of jazz going to R&B. You know, there was already plenty of examples of a lot of R&B sounding jazz throughout the 60s. It's strange to me. You know, Earth, Wind & Fire, Kool and the Gang, Ohio Players, a lot of those bands are doing stuff in the mid-60s, way before Bitches Brew, Silent Way. You know, there's a crossover happening long before Miles makes everybody go, oh, jazz, rock, and R&B, what a brilliant concept. Freddie Hubbard, number 4073. He's one of my favorite players in jazz, and my love for him only grows with every episode I do, with every throat grabbers I do. I keep finding more places where Freddie Hubbard is kicking my ass. Listen to the dexterity. And again, we talk about rhythm and the river of rhythm. And let's talk about the tempo of this brook. That's some fast moving water. That water doesn't even have to be that deep to knock you the fuck over. That water's cooking. And Hubbard's just a salmon, swimming, dancing, flashing, hopping up against that current. There you go. Jimmy Heath. I forgot Jimmy Heath was on this till I just looked. It's an interesting lineup, actually. Julian Priester on the trombone. Cedar Walton makes a pretty early appearance for him. Larry Ridley and Philly Joe Jones. So it's not a traditional lineup in that sense. Priester and Heath are both pretty much Riverside guys. Cedar Walton has some blue notes, some prestige. Philly Joe is more of a Riverside guy as well. So it's an interesting lineup. Another great album cover. You gotta admire Reed Miles' constant, creative album covers, and time after time, these records, 50 years later, still look fantastic. A guy that had played with Mingus and had really kind of earned his pedigree, that Alfred Lion gave a nice contract to. He makes, I think, 6-7 records for Blue Note over the next few years, is Horace Parlan. And Parlan ends up in Europe, and we've talked before how when guys go to Europe, it ends up kind of obscuring their careers in America, and people kind of lose sight of those artists. But the Turrentine Brothers were on this, along with George Tucker and Al Harewood, on the spur of the moment. I think Louis Gucci's on this. What's that one called? Yeah, Scoochie. Fantastic. This is Spur of the Moment, which is a great song. And That I Am So In Love is a wonderful ballad. Tommy Turrentine is kind of an under-heralded trumpet player. Like a lot of fire. Stanley's that laid-back kind of groove. That's Scoochie. Great riff. Fantastic sound. It's a Booker Irvin track. I knew it was somebody interesting who wrote that. Number 4074. Ba, ba, ba. 4075. In the interest of keeping us moving along, Donald Byrd. Catwalk. Pepper Adams is on this as well, with Duke Pearson, Layman Jackson, and Philly Joe Jones. And that quintet is together for a couple years. They're playing clubs together. Duke Pearson is about to become elevated in Blue Note's stable, because Ike Quebec's going to pass here shortly, which is sad because Ike Quebec's in the middle of a comeback, as it were. And he's putting out some great material here in 61, 62, and he passes away. And Duke Pearson's about to become the new A&R guy at Blue Note, which will kind of disintegrate this group. But the Pepper Adams, Donald Byrd, Duke Pearson group, it's a fantastic fivesome. You know, Byrd is in a very prolific point of his career here. He's putting out a lot of records every year. Him and Pepper Adams have a real natural, going back to childhood, companion. Like, they're just comfortable with each other. And it always kind of sticks out and is very apparent. Donald Byrd had a love for cars. You see cars on several of his album covers. Not a cheap one by the looks of it. And for a black jazz musician, that was kind of the sign you made it. You didn't get to license merchandise and have a mansion that was sprawling in Beverly Hills. You probably had a decent home and a nice car. And that was fantastic. That was living the life. That was, we made it. Armstrong, for all of his years of being the ambassador of this music, had a pretty modest home in Queens and never felt the need to spend beyond that. From what I understand, Armstrong was a fairly charitable guy. Horace Silver is still at Blue Note, of course, and will be for a while yet. He likes to do some great live tracks. This is still with Blue Mitchell, and I think Junior Cook. Yep, Gene Taylor and Roy Brooks. So it's still the great quintet. And wonderful. Again, it's a slightly softer cousin of the Jazz Messenger Blakey sound. You can hear the piano in there. Again, there's elements of Ray Charles, Booker T. You can hear how soul and jazz are grafted together. Dexter Gordon, 4077. This is doing all right. I think it's his second record on Blue Note. And I've said a lot about Dexter before. He's truly one of the most important sax players of all time. Regardless of generation, regardless of era, Dexter Gordon plays a very pivotal role in the sound of the tenor saxophone. Like I said in the last episode, the sound of Hawkins and Illinois Jacquet and Ben Webster and Lester Young all comes forward through Dexter. And then you add in the elements of Parker and Wardell Gray and bebop, which Dexter was very fluent in. And that melodic center coupled with the aggressive tempos, Dexter's just one of the great players of all time. And Rollins and Coltrane are both very much cast in the Dexter Gordon role. Dexter has made his comeback to Blue Note at this point after being in jail for most of the late 50s. And his string of recordings here at Blue Note are outstanding. Freddie Hubbard. I just heard that little beep, and I'm like, that's got to be Freddie. And there it is. But that's the blues. See how minimal Hubbard is? See the space between his phrasing? The breathing is what gives his notes more impact. And it's such a clean delivery. Rhythmically, tonally, he hits the exact center of that note and that tone with every interval. Him and Clifford Brown, I've said it many times, are the only two that really have that capacity to never warble or to have to kind of bend it up to where they want to be. he always has the clarity, the clean structure of his playing. Horace Parlan plays the piano on this. George Tucker and Al Harewood. It's a nice little quintet. This is a great groove. This is the first song on side 2, Society Red, which is probably a comment on the Red Scare that was going on at the time. I'm going to pause this. We'll start with part 2 after this.